Right, I guess we'll begin. So, Anant, we're very happy to have Anant Sudarshan from the University of Chicago, who's going to give a talk on the decline of vultures in India. So, Anant, whenever you're ready.
Yep, I will. Let me just share the screen. Okay, is this visible?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for the invitation. I'm going to be presenting what is still kind of early work and work in progress. So I'd be very glad for interruptions, comments, suggestions, the whole lot. This is joint work with Eyal Frank, who is also at the University of Chicago at the Harris School. And I'm going a little further afield from the sort of stuff I normally do research on. So this is kind of an interesting topic for me to present as well. So this paper that I'm going to be talking about is essentially looking at the social costs of the destruction of a keystone species, in this case of vultures in India, right? So it's kind of motivated from a sort of startling reality of the sort of era we live in, which is that we are, if you use kind of a statistical definition of sort of extinction rates, we are basically in the sixth mass extinction the world has seen. And since nothing has dramatically changed about since the 1800s to 2010, nothing has sort of changed in this period dramatically about the Earth's climate and so on, especially in the early part of that period. This sort of mass extinction is likely driven largely by human activity, right? So the empirical fact of many species being declared extinct is real. Why that is the case is obviously debatable, but human activity is a large part of it. And birds are kind of right up there in this picture. So this kind of raises the question of sort of what how should we as a society deal with this problem? In particular, since this is an economics audience, how much money should we throw at this problem? And how should we decide which species to try and recover, if that's possible, or kind of, put money into conservation to prevent endangered species from slipping into extinction? And so, one way of doing that is essentially, what we call existence values, which is we look around the world and there are certain species that catch our imagination. The tiger is one. It has for a while. That's kind of the famous William Blake poem. So the tiger is well represented in our art, in our literature. The panda bear perhaps is another species that has a lot of personal charisma going for it and gets correspondingly a large amount of conservation funding. What do you do with a species like the vulture? It's less easy to see the vulture becoming a target of conservation activity because people find the bird cute or people find the bird majestic. This is sort of a apocryphal quote that is attributed to Charles Darwin when he first saw a vulture for the first time, and it's kind of a reaction that many people have. So if we're going to use existence values to sort of determine which species to protect or conserve, you're potentially going to make these decisions based on somewhat superficial characteristics. Okay? So the argument for this, or one argument for this kind of paper, or this strand of research, is that if we could learn more about quantifying the ecosystem functions of different species, then we would be in a position to more efficiently guide our allocation decisions. At any rate, we may decide to value a tiger a great deal for itself, but we would be able to look at other costs and benefits that are maybe more anthropocentric, maybe more instrumental and functional, and that might lead us to change which species we choose to protect. Right? So this kind of cost-benefit analysis is well known to be challenging. It's known to be challenging for theoretical reasons and empirically. Theoretically, species decline, and the vultures that I'll talk about is an example of this, are often very sudden and and almost irreversible. And so in that kind of setting, it's hard to consider cost-benefit analysis because you have a limited amount of information on likely costs and benefits. You have uncertainty about where these thresholds might occur. And so when you're deciding whether to exploit a resource or not, it's challenging to carry out that kind of cost-benefit analysis sensibly when you have these sort of unknown unknowns, which is how extinctions often happen. And as I said, I think the vulture example of this paper is an excellent example of how that happens. The other problem is less, about carrying out the theoretical exercise of the cost-benefit analysis, but more that empirically, although we do know that biodiversity loss in general is at least correlated with various measures of economic and ecological damages, identifying the effects of specific species losses is harder, and there's much less work on that. There's some recent papers, one of which is written by my author, who's the expert on this, which is on bats. So that paper is sort of looking at how the decline of fruit bats, leads to kind of this spillover of the growth of other species, in that case insects, and costs for that reason. There's some well-known work on the use of wolves and wolves in national parks in the United States, where the reduction in the wolf population means you have a large increase in deer, and then all sorts of spillover effects from there. So the wolf is also a keystone species. But these kind of examples are sort of few and far between and a bit scattered. So in this paper, we're going to look at vultures, and we're going to try and think about vultures in this way. It's an important but relatively underfunded, important in terms of a species that used to be important in India, underfunded in terms of how much money the government is putting into vulture conservation. And so there's a certain policy relevance to this question, and that's kind of what I want to probe here. Is there so by the way, if there are any questions, just interrupt me, because I don't know if I can see I don't think I can see hands or anything, so someone will just have to interrupt me. Okay, so just kind of a brief outline of what I'm going to walk through, if in case you have to leave. Just 1 second. Yeah. So I'm going to try and show you first that the decline in vultures in India is sort of a classic example of this exogenous sudden threshold shock that is both unpredictable and uncorrelated with other things. So it's really vultures being taken out of the system, and we'll talk about why that happens. Second, I'll talk through a little bit about why vultures might be important beyond their cuteness or lack thereof, and that's because of their role as scavengers. I'm then going to use a difference in differences approach, and I'll talk through the specification to examine the effect of vultures on human mortality. Now, this is work in progress. There are 2 or 3 other outcome variables that we're hoping to look at if we can get the data for it, and your suggestions would be very valuable there. But what I'll try and show you today is some early results on the impact of the destruction of these vultures on mortality, and in particular an effect size that's very large, which is the loss of vultures in areas where they existed has led to an increase in all-cause adult mortality of about 20% of the 1993 baseline. It's about one part in 1,000 on a base of about 5. So these are large effects, and we can discuss why you might see effect sizes so large.
And one clarificatory question. What is vulture decline exogenous to? Like, what do you mean when you say that it's exogenous?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, if vulture declines were, occurred, for example, consider, for example, if I was exploiting a natural resource that a particular species depended on, right? And then that species was to go extinct in areas where the natural resource was being exploited more. You're likely to see correlations, confounders between the effect of that species on outcomes and the effect of the natural resource depletion on other outcomes. So that's kind of the general endogeneity problem that you'd be struggling with in this kind of setting. If you overfish, you might kill fish. You get some benefits from that fishing, and maybe there are some costs through another channel that the fish imposes on you, and it's kind of hard to tell them apart. So what I'm going to be arguing is that the mechanisms through which vultures went extinct is kind of ideally suited to this kind of analysis, which would otherwise be very difficult. You can't obviously randomly assign an absence or presence of a species, and species presence is correlated with everything else about a region. But we can,
just the sort of you showed that picture, right, with the species. How much should we worry about the fact that some of this could just be driven by the fact that we don't have good information going back in time, or is that not something to worry about?
I mean, so this is you mean on extinction rates?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is this is obviously not my area, but my understanding is that people are fairly confident about the background levels by looking at evidence of these presence of these species over time and kind of when it disappears. But it's possibly the case, and as I said, this is now more speculation, that becomes more difficult for things like insects and so on than it is perhaps for large mammals. Yeah. For large mammals and for birds, we do have fossil records and genetic records that go back. I'm not going into prehistory here, so this is only the last few hundred years. Yeah. So this is very much a time of written records of good data on from around the world. This is not kind of going back to the Jurassic period or anything. So I believe these are generally regarded as real changes in the rate of species decline.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Anant, one more comment. So if I'm not wrong, vulture population has been declining since 1980s in India. And as far as I know, one of the reasons for that decline was the use of dichlorofenac, which is an antibiotic fed to
so I'm going to be using that as the extinction cause, and I'll just talk through what evidence we have on dates and the process. But you're exactly right. That's the proximate cause of extinction.
So is it not the case that the use of dichlorofenac is likely to be correlated with the intensity of exploitation of any kind of species or resources?
So if we why don't we, if we wait like 2-3 slides, I'll just come to my dichlorofenac exhibits, and then kind of we can, it'll be easier to discuss that. But I'll get to precisely that because I will be talking about dichlorofenac in this context. Just give me two slides away. So I think first, we know that vultures have disappeared in India. It's actually, unfortunately, difficult to put numbers on the rate and extent of the decline. And that is because the disappearance of vultures in India is sort of an unprecedented event in terms of magnitude. It's in recent history the largest disappearance of birds in terms of numbers. There were over 40 million vultures, according to some estimates in the early and mid 80s. We're down to a few thousand today. There were no national population counts as a consequence of the vulture, because the bird was far too populous to merit attention in that way. And then the decline in the population was so quick that by the time we got around to counting and noticing, the species had already been decimated to a significant degree. So we do not have, therefore, access to a vulture census in India. In some sense, because we are in the world of binaries, we basically have no vultures around at all today, near zero. We had millions and millions across the country earlier. This decline, to the best evidence that that there exists, actually isn't in the 80s. It's more like the early 90s. This figure on the right is from a paper by a bunch of scientists using the sources of data that do exist for species for whom we have not been doing censuses, which is basically index-based data. So, for example, counts in certain national parks where that data is collected, road transit counts, and so on. So those are turned into an index, and on the y-axis here you have basically a logarithmic scale. And the main thing I want you to take away from is in the areas where you're tracking the vulture, remember, not all over. So for example, Kaladeo National Park is one of them. In the areas you're tracking the vulture, you find a decline in around the first half of the 1990s. This sharp decline, this is down to 1/1000th of what it was in the early 80s by 2005, 2000, and so this is an extraordinary fall in the size of the population over an extraordinarily short period of time, right? By the standards of these things. To kind of put that in context, the passenger pigeon extinction took about a century, and this, the speed of this decline has as I get to discussing the reason for it, the speed of the decline will turn out to be very important. It's a large part of why we were unable to arrest the decline. So that's what we know about how quickly this population fell off. And sort of this level at the start is maybe more around, think of this as about 40 million. Think of this as about, I think there are 15,000 in India now.
Hi, Anant. Are you in India? Can I say one?
Yes.
So IUCN in India is maintaining a good record of the decline in vulture population in India. Maybe you can check with them. So what species declined, from which number to what number, which species, because there are 20 different species of vultures in India and they have a very good record. Maybe you should check with them.
Yeah, I've collected some data from them. We are actually still trying to get some more. It's of course, the better, it's there's much more careful accounting of vulture populations now, because we know, now they are endangered and much more carefully tracked. So, I haven't been able to get good data that is from a country count. I mean, I was told it doesn't exist going back to the 80s, but I'm sure we can fill this in a little bit more. This is just from one paper that pulls together about 4 surveys. Some of the authors of this paper are in the IUCN, so it is coming from their data. In part, it may not be all of that data. That's something I'm definitely looking to collect more on this, right? So to come to this question now of sort of why did these birds die? I think the key part of the problem with the vulture decline is that, as you can see here, this fall in the population is in the sort of mid 90s is when it sort of starts falling by all indications. It's only in 2004 that that a reasonable hypothesis with evidence was provided for why the vultures had disappeared. And this is now heavily cited paper in Nature, basically pointing out that the reason these birds were dying and dying very quickly was because of a chemical called diclofenac. Diclofenac is used as an anti-inflammatory agent and a painkiller. It's used, it was widely used for cattle. It has now been banned and is still illegally used, but much less. It's also used on humans. And last year, in fact, there was a ban placed on sales of diclofenac for human use as well, because it was getting diverted to cattle. So diclofenac is intensely toxic to vultures. And when cattle are treated with this painkiller, when they die, the carcass contains traces of it, which is enough to kill a bird that then feeds on that carcass. The crucial point here is that the effect is fast, it's highly destructive, and we did not know what was causing vultures to die until 2004, by which time there will be barely any vultures around, right? So this is very much a sort of mystery that we were unable to resolve until, in some sense, it was too late to resolve. Now, the question is sort of, diclofenac has been around as a drug, as a chemical compound for a long time under the brand name Voltaren in Europe, where Novartis was, I think, producing it under that brand name. So diclofenac did not just emerge in the 1990s. So the question is sort of what happened in the 1990s to make this a problem in India. So we found some, anecdotal evidence. Well, we know why it suddenly started getting used widely, which is that there was an expiry of a patent on the drug. So you could then produce generic versions of diclofenac, which were much cheaper. We looked through, so in the published literature, we found references to the 1990s in general. Looking through sort of the FDA documentation in the United States, where the drug was first patented, the first application for a generic version was made in 1993, right? There's another paper by Cuthbert et al. In 2014, which follows on from the Nature paper and is trying to look into how diclofenac was being sold, and they find evidence suggesting that in 1994 diclofenac prescriptions were widespread in India in the veterinary clinics that they surveyed. So for this kind of identifies the treatment that we're going to be using. Okay, so the treatment is that in 1993 a patent expires, and a drug that had been around previously is now around cheaply and can enter the Indian market. We know that by 1994, for certain, it was fairly widespread in the Indian market. So in 1993 is when this treatment turns on. Now, the use of diclofenac had no known effect of vultures in 1993. And the continued use of diclofenac was not affected by any vulture declines between 1993 and 2004, because it's only in 2004 that we even figured out what was causing these birds to die. And then there have been a sequence of bans placed on diclofenac since the publication of that paper. But in our period of interest, which is before 93 and then after 93 up to about 2001 to 2002, which is the data set we have, you have an unknown cause that is present anywhere where there are cattle, and turns on in 1993, not because there's a new invention in 1993, but because the Novartis patent expired in 1993. So that's the treatment we use, and that's why I am arguing that this sort of event study design provides a reasonably exogenous shock that's not correlated with other things going on ground, and is not correlated with in particular. I think the most important thing is it's not happening with the knowledge that diclofenac is killing vultures.
Anant,
yeah.
It would be more convincing if you had the data on prices, right? Wouldn't that be easy to get?
So it's on our very long to-do list of things. I have no idea how to get the data on prices. So
this particular drug would be for the cattle, right? Not for human beings, because the human beings drug pricing you can get very easily from, I mean, these we may even have it in ISI, this agency that collects all the data on drug prices in India, and then they have pretty much annual time series for all the drugs.
If they have it going back to then, or at least, I think human would also be useful, because yes, diclofenac is very popular, or was very popular for cattle, but it is also used for humans, and it is still used for humans. So to the extent
I think I bought this data set from 91 to 2000. So this might be there. We'll have a look.
Oh, that would be very, very helpful. Yeah.
The other thing, Anant, is that if it's also driven by livestock in cattle, you could also use this like a biotic idea with the livestock from the livestock census, which there is a pretty good livestock census that India has. And in fact, that would have, I would guess, district variation, right? Because the amount of livestock is, I think, you can get it at a district level. So, so you could actually look at, differential kind of, but of course, I don't know if you have temporal, spatial variation in vulture deaths, but for mortality, for sure, you'll also have district level variation, right? So it'll be like a change after 93. It'll be a change after 93, but it'll be differential across space, depending on the amount of cattle before that.
Yes. So the livestock census.
There's one other point, Anant. So the other way you can do this is you can check when the generics were marketed. So all of this information has to be with the drug controller of India, because they have to approve every drug that's on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I know the generic was first produced in 93, but you're right. If we have, we could hopefully get more direct marketing information. This paper over here, unfortunately, doesn't have a time series of surveys from these clinics. So all it tells us is that in 1994 they were in. So that's why I'm using 1993 legal approval. 1994 Cuthbert says that they are finding it prescribed, therefore it must have entered the Indian market today. But you're right, if we had evidence from sort of the supply side, so to speak, whether it's pricing or marketing, we could certainly.
Yeah, and they'll both happen at the same time. The moment the generics come out, the price will fall by a factor of 2 orders of magnitude.
Yes, for sure. I mean, because that is certainly the approximate cost, because it's not like a new drug. So as a
yeah.
Sort of,
so yeah, I mean, I maybe Abhirup already has this data and you can get it from him, but otherwise I'm sure it's there with the drug control of India, and it's all public stuff. It has to be, because all the companies have to have it.
Yeah,
I'm sure. Can I intervene? I'm sure diclofenac price is available. It's a very, very cheap drug, and it was highly subsidized, so anybody can afford. Any poor, a farmer having a cattle can afford it, and it used to be, I think, given free in some of the veterinary clinics. So the price data is there. And so for the vulture population district-wise, I think it's difficult to know, because vultures, they have, I think they move in a radius of 200, 300 kilometers.
Yes.
So it may be difficult to, say what are the vulture population in a district, but all India data is there with IUCN. Can find out.
Yeah, the spatial data, I'll show you the approach we use, but you're right, vultures don't stay within a district anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
But you can take it more than a district. I mean, you could take a bunch of contiguous districts, around particular areas. I mean,
yeah, so that's essentially what we are doing. I'm using these habitat maps. I'll show you sort of what we're doing, and this is definitely something we'd like to add more data on. I guess so. Were you suggesting the drug controller of India as the source for potentially information on prices and marketing?
Yeah. But I mean, first, if Abhirup has already got it, first
Yes.
take it from him. Then
Abhirup,
we can look.
I'll send you an email.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's moving on. Okay. So here's kind of how now, in order to identify this, since vultures have gone to zero pretty much everywhere, where is our variation going to come from? So there are basically three vultures. There are multiple vulture species in India. The three main ones, this is not, for example, the Himalayan vulture, which is still around, but the three main species that were affected by diclofenac were the slender-billed, white-backed, and long-billed vultures. Now, we don't have population counts of these vultures, in each district. As I said, I'm not sure that it exists going back to those dates, but also vultures move around, so it's not a meaningful measure. But what we do have are species distribution models. Now, a species distribution model is essentially using yeah. So a species distribution model is essentially using a high dimensional vector of habitat characteristics. This could be temperature, it could be vegetation type, land use, climate indicators, and so on. And information on where the species in question has been seen, which is going to be available only in a few places. You use those two to relate a probability of presence to habitat characteristics, and then predict out using that. Now, we can do a version. You can do a version of this yourselves. A much better version for most endangered species exists. Has been done by BirdLife International, which also specifies the data on which the IUCN bases, its categorization of endangered and critically endangered avian species. So these guys are the experts, and you can buy range maps that are generated from these kind of machine learning models from BirdLife International. So what we did was we bought those range maps for these three species of vultures. And each of them has a different coverage over India. We then divide the districts in India into terciles based on how many species ranges overlap with that district. So for example, if 100% of a district is covered by all three species, all three can survive there, that goes into the highest tercile. There are districts where only one species range map overlaps or no species overlaps, and so those go into the bottom tercile. So we construct a score that is just the product of the area of a species indicator and the area of the district that is covered by the BirdLife International range maps for that district. And then we group these districts into these three groups, right? So the map on the right shows that distribution. So the pale pink areas are places where there was either just one vulture species or no vulture species, with these ranges overlapping, and then the others are 2 and 3, the lighter and darker. Now, what this means is that there are cattle all over the place, right? But it's only in these areas that the interaction of cattle with diclofenac interacts with vultures to produce a change in the baseline biodiversity, right? So it's in areas where there were vultures that when the cattle come in and when the diclofenac comes in and cattle start being prescribed diclofenac, that's where the biodiversity drops, right? So the effect on different districts is different, even though it goes from, basically to zero everywhere across the country. So that's sort of where our spatial variation is coming from. What is the sort of, before I kind of get into what the regression equation looks like, is not very complicated. What is the, most of you probably know this, but I think what's interesting about vultures in this context is that the ecological function they serve as scavengers. Now, when would this become very important? It's going to become important, one, if there are no substitutes, which is the case for vultures. So there are other species, rats and dogs, for example, that will eat carrion, but not as their preferred food source. And so they will not efficiently dispose of carrion. Whereas for vultures, it is their primary sole food source. And so, and because they existed in large numbers, there isn't another species that scavenges in a way that is even a halfway decent substitute for vultures. So in that sense, the ecological function is unique. It's linked to unique biological characteristics. They have a highly acidic stomach that is sort of off the charts more than other species, which means that even infected carcasses with a high pathogen content are things that vultures can eat, but no other species will. Even if a dog or a rat is eating carrion.
Anant, I think you're making this way too strong. I don't think it's not true that there aren't substitute species. Crows, for example, carrion eaters.
No, there are species that eat carrion. There are no species that eat carrion in the amounts that vultures do.
I think, yeah, but I think you have to make the more modest claim. It's not as if these carcasses won't get eaten by jackals and crows and pigs and other dogs and so on.
Okay, so they are clearly being eaten by dogs. So you're right. It is the fact that dogs are eating it is going to be part of the reason we are concerned about the vultures going. Maybe let me rephrase that to say vultures are particularly efficient scavengers. And it's not clear that there's equally efficient scavenging going on now in the absence of those vultures. We also produce a large number of carcasses in India. So if the combination of a large number of cattle and religious injunctions against eating cattle mean that there's a large number of cattle who die and form carcasses. So the need for disposal of carcasses is very high in India. And your outside options, incinerators and chemical disposal and so on, is more limited in a country like India. And of course, those have their additional environmental costs, but leaving those aside, they are more limited. So you have a country which had an efficient scavenger, a large number of carcasses, and not great alternatives. So let's just say the disappearance of vultures, therefore, is a consequential change in this service, in this ecosystem service, in the context of India, in a way that might be different from other parts of the world where there are also vultures.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, but I think what you say that there aren't substitutes, that's simply not true.
Okay, so yeah, that's fair. I think the main thing I want to flag here is that there's a consequential loss in ecosystem functions from the disappearance of the vulture.
Can I say something here?
Yeah.
Professor M.N. Murthy and others have a paper on vultures, and with decline in vultures and the carcass being eaten by other substitutes and dogs and other things, they have a high health cost on humans. So that paper in ecological economics will help. They say so vultures are the most efficient species to eat these dead animals, and
Yes.
they don't pose any health cost on human. And if the same dead animals are being eaten by other dogs and jackals and birds and all, so they also have a high health impact on humans.
Exactly.
So,
and that in fact
is right there.
Yeah, that's sort of what why this loss is going to be important. Now, obviously, there are other, the picture on the right is an old picture of the Towers of Silence in Mumbai. So there are communities for which this scavenging function is important beyond just getting rid of carcasses. So there are basically two mechanisms through which we are hypothesizing, and it is not when I say we, there's of course research on both of these that people have done in the past, including the paper we just mentioned. But there are sort of two mechanisms that we are hoping to kind of flesh out with data in the paper. The first is, you have fewer vultures, so you have more carcasses. feral dogs and rats, those two in particular, are the species that step in to feed off of those carcasses in the absence of vultures eliminating them. So you have an increase in the population of dogs and rats, and dogs in particular are carriers of rabies. So you have an increase in the population of rabies. And that has mortality and morbidity costs on human beings. So that's one channel. The other channel is, okay, if dogs and rats are not eating your carcasses, then carcasses are often disposed in water bodies, or when rainwater falls on those carcasses, it carries pathogens into water bodies. So there's a relationship between the number of carcasses you have lying around and water pollution levels, and then via water pollution, health costs of different kinds. So those are the two kind of mechanisms through which we're kind of surmising that the disappearance of vultures is going to feed back into damages for human beings. I think those are the two main ones that we also have found in the literature previously. So the carcass dumps, I mean, yeah, most people in this audience know this, but it's a serious problem. It's also not, even though a lot of the cattle is in rural areas, carcass dumps are often on the outskirts of urban areas, and there's plenty of cattle in peri-urban areas. You have both known dumps where there are a lot of animal carcasses, which is, for example, that's a news story on the left for outside Gurgaon. And then you also have illegal dumping into landfills and garbage dumps that are otherwise not meant for animals, and you would think don't have animals, but there's illegal dumping in them. So these carcasses find themselves into the outskirts of Indian cities, and it's if you just Google, you'll find any number of news stories and citizen complaints asking for incinerators and complaining about carcasses being in and about their house. So that's kind of how you would expect urban India to be potentially affected, because these are then the places where dogs will feed and the feral population will grow. So with kind of that in place, the empirical approach we're taking so far is quite straightforward. So it's an event study type model, and then a associated kind of long differences aggregated model. Basically, we look at, so on the left-hand side, this Y is district, A is urban, rural, state, and year. So on the left-hand side is, for example, say all-cause mortality. On the right-hand side, we have a dummy for whether a district is vulture suitable or not. And so basically, those three terciles are being binned into two dummies where, if you're in tercile 2 or 3, where you had at least 2 or 3 species of vultures overlapping, you're given a high suitability indicator. If you're in the lowest tercile, where you're 0, 1, you're given a low suitability indicator 0. Obviously, you can also do this for 3 dummies, but the results I'll show you is for this high vulture suitability. And then a bunch of fixed effects, a time fixed effect, a fixed effect for district into sort of urban or rural. We have a couple of robustness specifications where we make these time trends, these time fixed effects into, say, state time fixed effects. Some controls, these are mostly sort of weather and climate controls. We're trying to think a little more deeply about what we could add in there, but right now the results have basically climate controls. And so this is going to give you the long differences version of that is just adding this over the entire post period. So the post period is in our definition after 1993. And so you look at this coefficient on these vulture suitable areas in the post period relative to the pre period. And so that is the effect, that beta is the effect of diclofenac turning on, i.e. vultures dying in high suitability areas relative to low suitability areas. To the extent that low suitability areas are not zero vulture areas, both because vultures might fly there, long distances, and because we count places with one species in that group, our results
just
may
a question, your first equation. What is T lower bar and what is T upper bar?
Oh, that's the time period that we're looking at. So we start in 88 and in some specifications 81 and we go up to 2001. So it's just a time period. There's a reason I put that in there, which is that we're trying to extend the front and back. So hopefully they spread a bit.
So 88 to when did you say?
88 to 2001 is what our primary specifications are based on. The reason is basically 1988 is when the Indian civil registration records switch from rates to counts. So, we sort of start in 88. If you're willing to kind of do some conversions before that, then you can go up to 81 in the data set that we have. But that's the time span. 93 is the break point or the event time.
And why aren't you going beyond? Because why are you stopping in 2001? What's the reason for that?
Well, currently, most of these choices are driven by the data we've been able to get. I think it's what we are struggling with more is pre-period data, not post-period data. In the sense, yeah, we could extend it beyond that, and I think we've now got some till 2005 as well. But the challenge we are facing is that I'll show you our results. Our results are not based on balanced panels. Or at least we can make it balanced. That requires throwing out several states. There's a lot of missing data, especially in the pre-period, as we go back to before, in the 1990s and in the 1980s. And so that's why I was trying to, get those.
You mean there's missing data in the civil registration system?
So the civil registration authorities at the center informed us that this is a state subject. They do not keep reports since 2005. They have nothing older than that. Some states like UP and Bihar, and I mean, it is somewhat astonishing to me as well, but we really have tried hard. Basically say they don't know where this data is. They don't have any old reports on their recorded births and deaths, even though civil registrations were technically going on. It's not digitized and they say they don't have paper reports. So we have basically hit a brick wall.
No, just to understand, the reason your panel is unbalanced is because of these gaps in the civil registration data. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So not all states span the full time period. 88 has another advantage, which is over 88 to 2001. Most of the states, that are in our data set are reporting in that. If we go before or after, it's like I'm missing, say, the data for Uttar Pradesh, for 91.
But surely that can't be true going after.
As you get later, it's not. So after 2004, you pretty much have data for everything. So we could extend it at the back, at the front end.
Why don't you do that?
We can do that. We collected it recently, so it's not in the regressions I have here, but it's not, that's not a constraint. I'll do it. We'll do it next time we do that.
Anant, there is a vulture breeding program by almost all the state governments. I think wherever you have a zoo, so they have this program. So shouldn't we be having a dummy in your equation there? Artificial breeding of vultures?
That's a good point. We could consider introducing one when it started. I don't have it now, but I will find out about the vulture breeding programs and see if we can add in a dummy when.
Yeah, they have it. I think in almost most of the states they have it. Like I think this is the most successful one. Is there in Pinjore, Punjab. Pinjore, I think Pinjore Garden, that's Chandigarh. And then we have in Delhi Zoo, and we have in almost all the state zoos, they have a vulture breeding center. So
yeah, so I will, that's a good point. I'll try and collect data on how many birds they've bred and when they started breeding. And you're right, probably a specification with a dummy for that would be helpful. But right now, what I'll show you doesn't, we haven't yet got that data, so I won't have that. since we're talking about data, I think if any of you know how we can get hold of sample registration system reports so the civil registry data, although we put in these time trends and so on to try and control for reporting issues and fixed effects, is known to be worse. The sample registration system technically also collects data at a sub-state level. It has the same problem that it's not available online. The RGI office is not being very helpful in giving us old reports. So I don't know if the ISI library keeps the SRS reports. So I had asked you about the civil registry reports, which I wasn't that surprised to find weren't there, but maybe the SRS reports are there. So we are trying to improve this a bit.
Anant, the census also, of course, it's not for every year, but from the census also you can get, at least for the census years, the mortality rates by district.
Yes, and I think one of the things we thought actually might not be a bad idea, although you can't make a pretty picture, but you can get, you could then do a long differences certainly with just the census. So we've been kind of focusing on these year annual data sets. And we do have some data, I'll show you. It's not that we haven't got anything, but I'm still hoping to collect more. And you're right, the census is a reasonable option if you're not doing the annual specification. We also have some data on dogs. So you want to, at least one of those channels is going through dogs. And so the livestock census gets, counts dogs. So we've been collecting livestock census data. I'll show you some results from that, but that's still ongoing. And water pollution data is something we still want to collect. So I won't show you anything on water pollution. I'll skip over the summary stats, except to point out that sort of, the habitat area overlap ranges from about 0 to 75% of district area in our sample. And these are sort of the main variables of interest in this. So here's kind of the sort of results we have from that first specification, annual specification. So this is using all-cause death rate from the civil registration data. As I said, we have the civil registration data for about, I think it's 18 states. And I've drawn this between 88 and 2001 because that's where we have most of our data. As Som points out, going further than 2001 is perfectly possible. The challenge is in the first half. But we see for all-cause death rate, this is comparing just the best with the worst. This is comparing the top two terciles with the worst. But we see an evidence of an increase in the relative death rates in places that had vultures after diclofenac, where these two trends are basically flat before. They're parallel before. There's no difference before. But after diclofenac, and this is gradually increasing as you would expect to see. It's not that the moment the patent was released, all the birds had diclofenac, but that's after that point you do see an increase in death rates. And I would say this speed of increase is consistent with the mechanism that we have in mind is the gradual use of this drug.
So I have
this
a question
ends up
about
being about a 20% increase off of this baseline.
I have a question about your vertical axis.
Mm-hmm.
Why are these numbers so small? I mean, the average death rate is about 8 per 1,000.
The average death rate is about 8 per 1,000. I think there are two things going on. First of all, this is the change. So this is the difference, right? This is 3 to relative to 1. It's the betas in that coefficient. So it's not 2 lines. So it's the difference between those 2 lines. That's the main reason. And the other reason is that the death rate from the civil registry data looks different from the death rate from the sample registration survey data because of reporting problems in the CRS. So the absolute values of, which is why I don't have 1 line for each. If you're going to use the civil registration data, then pretty much the only thing you can do with it is to look at changes, because the absolute levels are known to have severe underreporting problems.
So there's another question, which is that it seems to me that the size of effect is basically implausible.
The size of the effect is large.
I mean, what you're basically saying there is that a quarter of the, you get a 20 or 1/5 increase in the death rate through this channel. That seems like about 2 orders of magnitude too big.
I don't know. I mean, if your question is it large and surprising? To me, yes. Are there a bunch of things that could act through the mechanisms of water pollution? Even if you're not, I agree, rabies by itself wouldn't explain this. That's also true that you could have a lot going on through water pollution. I don't want to, as I said, I can't adjudicate the size of the effect, just based on this data that we have, but I'm hoping that the water pollution data, if it shows an increase in water pollution for some of these pathogens, maybe that will.
And even if you added up all the deaths due to water pollution or any kind of pollution, you're not going to get numbers like this, right? Remember, what are people dying? If you just look at different causes of death, there's no way that any one of these things.
But it's not, if you have high amounts of pathogens from carcasses and water pollution, you're going to have a high morbidity burden across a whole range of diseases. So I don't know I don't think it's that easy for us to ascribe the share of increased morbidity and then deaths to water pollution or not water pollution. At least I don't know of that, marginal effect of water pollution on deaths number. So I acknowledge it's a large effect size. I don't know whether it's 2 orders of magnitude too large or not.
Well, it's at least 1, if not 2.
Well, there's also.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah,
think about the different sources of water pollution. If you break down these things, even if you say that water pollution is the biggest driver, if you just break these things down and ask what are the biggest sources of water pollution, it's not going to be carcasses releasing bacteria. It's going to be sewage. Because, you have more than 1 billion people.
I mean, well, it depends on...
if you just look at the sheer magnitude of things, it's just totally implausible.
So I think so here's my proposed approach. One is to get some more data on the dogs and the pollution. I'll show you something on the dogs, but the other is, perhaps if I can get hold of the sample registration system data that is regarded as higher quality than the CRS, and you don't have to hand wave as much about reporting errors. So, possibly the more conservative one of those two might, be better. The third thing that I can think of doing is, some of these ideas like putting in dummies for vulture breeding programs and so on. So there are other specifications that might reduce this. There is, my sense is that once we try some of those, perhaps I can make a figure where the different point estimates from all of those are placed on something. And if there are, if there are some that end up being much smaller, then you could argue that this is not the best specification. But that's kind of the sort of plan I have. I agree it's large, but it is what it is right now. So the task is just to see, how to make sense of it or what's wrong.
But I mean, the most plausible explanation that comes to mind is that there was something about the divergences in these districts over time that was driving this, which has, other things going on, not vultures. And it just happens to be a coincidence that, your vulture boundaries happen to.
It's possible. I think that's where dogs...
Especially given that your vulture boundaries are highly geographically concentrated. You're basically comparing a small, if you're doing the 3:1 comparison, you're looking at that small area in North India versus, the outer districts of the country, the coastal districts. And if you're doing the other one, then, there's another boundary. But
Well, there's
That's
one
Anant,
idea that we
So
had.
all your
which is to use
identification
a
is being
triple
run off
interaction,
of those
which is
boundaries,
cattle.
right?
So one idea, Som, that we haven't tried, but which is theoretically possible, is to introduce cattle into the mix. Because right now, I've interacted vultures with diclofenac, but the livestock survey also tells you something about where there are more or less cattle. It's possible that we could use that as variation, because you should only have a problem where you have cattle and vultures and people at the same time. So
another thing you can do is, like, instead of using all these districts in this particular manner, you could take kind of adjoining districts to the various tercile levels and just run regressions on contiguous districts, right? Because then this idea that they are so different, because you're kind of, because it's very special in nature. So you're essentially comparing something in the middle of Madhya Pradesh with some trend of something which is in coastal Kerala and so on and so forth. I mean, you could select districts, it's one of these kind of boundary kind of, to think of the.
Maybe do a fuzzy version of that. I mean, obviously it's not going to be short by district because the habitat and the bird is, but I see what you mean. There might be a way of restricting comparisons to things that are closer to each other. So I'll try that. But anyways,
But you have district level variables that are changing over time as controls, right, on the right hand side.
Yes, but right now it's mostly climate.
You don't have population density and all those things typically that you can get from the census. I mean, there will be long-term trends basically, and these coefficients remain the same even with state level trends, though, because this particular is just with trending, right?
But yeah, so the state level trends, the coefficient mean estimate doesn't change much. It becomes slightly smaller, but not dramatically smaller. It becomes noisier, although still significant when you get, for example, in this, I don't have it right now, but tercile 3 to 1 looks quite similar. Tercile 3 and 2, it becomes a bit noisier. So, but the level does not dramatically change. So I think if we think the mean estimate is very high, which I agreed is quite high, I think it's probably got more to do with specifying a different set of comparisons, like you're suggesting, maybe switching data source or something. At this stage, I think finding pollution and dogs at least would help make it seem more likely that vultures are a part of this. And if we don't believe it's all of it. So we see most of our effects in urban areas, although this is as much noise as effect size, but the rural thing is pretty much a straight line. We see most of it happening in urban areas. That is sort of what one would expect. It's a much better habitat for dogs and rats. It's much denser, population densities are much higher, and the animal dumping sites tend to be close to urban areas. So even though the cattle may not start out there, that's where they end up when they're dead. We've started collecting data from the livestock census. Right now, running that same regression, and this is that long differences one, pre and post, we see an increase in dogs post 1990. So this is an increase in dogs relative to the 1992 level. So we've now managed to get some livestock census data for before 1992. So these are imprecise estimates, but they're all positive. They suggest there are more dogs as time goes on in places where vultures were prevalent earlier. Once we have finished cleaning the pre-data that we've managed to get for many states now, I'm hoping these become more precise. But this would at least show, although I can't relate this to the number of deaths I would expect, it does.
What are all these columns?
Oh, this is weighting basically. This is weighting by population. This is weighting by dog counts. This is weighting all districts equally.
So what should we be comparing? The columns next to each other?
No, this is the treatment effect. This first row. Sorry. HVS crossed.
I see that your terminal year, what is terminal year here?
This is the last year. This is the span of data that is being used to generate these tables. As I said, we've just managed to get data from before 92. So, all this is saying is that your relative to 92, there are more dogs in high vulture suitable areas. But obviously the vulture regression over here starts in 88. The dog regression is starting in 92, so it's not as good. But we managed to get some data in the pre-period. So we're trying to fill that.
Anand, what was the clustering
So I'm worried about this. Why are you seeing effects in 97 which are close to those in 2003? That should not be the case, because according to the graph you told us, the 90% decline in vulture population happens in the early 2000s, not in the late 90s. Whereas the first decline is seen in the late 90s, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, the first decline is reported in 96 or something. Am I right?
Well, I wouldn't want to put too much weight on 1 and 2 columns here, or at least, you could say this is a meaningless thing to show, but with this sort of standard error on when you weight them equally. So I think the population weighted ones are much better, because this counts some very small districts equally in percentage terms. This is a log outcome. If you look at the population weighted ones, which are for larger vultures, as for larger districts, you do see that if I take
so population weighted means you're weighting
up the districts which have more people, and this is weighting up the districts which have more dogs. So I think 3, 4, and 5 and 6 are much more what you would want to see. The problem with 1 and 2 is there are lots of small districts with very few people and very few dogs, and it produces a very noisy kind of estimate, which you're right looks similar. But the pattern of many more dogs later on does show up with 3, 4, and 5 and 6.
So the overall result, is that weighted? Because that has the same kind of problem, right?
The overall result is, we've done different versions. This one is weighted by population. The ones I'm showing you. It does have the same problem. If I just took equally weighted things, some of these very small districts can start, dominating a bit more. But as I said, I think this is directionally what you'd want. We've managed to get some data now from before 92, because this is in some sense, I really want to compare with dog levels well before this vulture period. So hopefully this goes in the way that I would like it to go, which is to become sharper with point estimates that remain similar. One thing I will say is that these point estimates line up with what Martindale, for example, there are a couple of papers that kind of do a back of the envelope thing of how many dogs from small surveys do we think relate to changes in the vulture population. How in areas which have lost all vultures, how much have dogs gone up by? These percentage changes are sort of in line, consistent with that. So these numbers are not crazy for any reason. They are imprecise.
Where are the dog numbers coming from?
The livestock census.
How do they get numbers of feral dogs?
Yeah, so what they do is they ask about pet dogs. They ask about dogs that are around the house that people know about, and dogs that are fed but are not owned. So truly feral dogs that are not interacting with humans too much and are never eating food that human beings provide are probably being missed out by the livestock census. So semi-feral is probably the best.
And you would think that the ones that are eating livestock from dumps are less likely to be the same ones that are being fed by people.
Well, they only have to be fed sometimes. So unless they're subsisting solely on those dumps, they might be counted. But you're right. The more disconnected you are from human beings, the less likely the livestock census is to capture you. However, unless we think that places which had a lot of vultures were suddenly, these are not pet dogs. So these are dogs hanging around. I'm not using pet dog numbers here. So these are those that are classified as feral by the livestock census.
So the livestock census breaks up the dog count?
Yeah, it breaks the dog count. And these are, so these are not, it's not that people are getting suddenly more pet dogs.
You're excluding the pet dogs.
I'm not using the pet dogs, yeah.
So you're using the ones that people feed, or
classified as feral dogs, yeah. I mean, they admit that there is a population of dogs that is being left out here that does not interact at all with human beings. So this is like your colony strays, if you like. Those will get, those are the sorts of things this is captured.
And for those, for the 2003 terminal year, you're seeing
large changes
of the order of 20%.
Yeah, with conditional on these, often conditional on these controls. Yeah. So do the, and those are not crazy per, you know, some of these other estimates of in these small sample studies of sort of how much would dogs have gone up by. So these are not off the charts crazy. They're just very imprecise. Now this 0.23 is a huge standard error attached to it. So I don't want to place too much weight on it yet, but hopefully, you know, now that we have a little bit more livestock census, especially in the pre-period, this can clean up. So this is kind of my last slide. So this is kind of thing, just thinking about how we go from here. So one question is, okay, does this suggest that conserving the vulture is worthwhile? Let's suppose you believe that these treatment effects are what they are, putting aside some skepticism for a bit. Those would be highly significant. There's an uncounted large increase in morbidity. So not everything is going to show up in mortality. We don't have any data on morbidity. And you might have other benefits. Okay, maybe vultures don't have any existence value because people don't like how they look, but you know, they, as I said, they have a religious value to some communities and so on. So there are other things that are in there that might make conserving the vulture worth a lot of money. On the flip side, and this is something we're trying to put some numbers on, vultures recover very, very slowly. So it takes 5 years to come to maturity, and they have about 1 offspring a year at best. So getting vultures from where they are now to anything near where they were is extraordinarily difficult. The health costs of all those carcasses are felt today. So it seems plausible, and I haven't done this calculation, that the net present value of building incinerators, even though they can be quite expensive, far exceeds investing in conservation of the vulture in terms of trying to reintroduce it to the wild. So although maybe ex ante you would much rather have vultures, there are many other painkillers, you would much rather have vultures and them eating the carcasses. It's plausible, I think, that expos starting today, you're not going to sit around waiting for the vulture population to recover if the health costs of those carcasses are high. Once you build out this infrastructure, there is those defensive expenditures mean the marginal gain from vultures is now zero. So it's plausible that if you did this accounting like this, you would not find much value to conserving the vulture.
Why can't these carcasses just be buried? I mean, surely that's cheaper. Just dig a hole in the ground.
There are all these complaints about people making, here's how they're supposed to be buried. They're supposed to be taken to carcass dumping grounds, buried deeply and covered with chemicals, so that destroys the bacteria and decomposes them. In practice, both the burying deeply and the chemicals are expensive, so people don't do those things. They bury them in a way that dogs and so on can capture them, or they just dump them on top, like that picture I showed you. So that's one problem. And then another problem, which I don't know how widespread it is that apparently there's a industry in using their bones, which, you know, for those of us who are building houses in Delhi, so carcass bones are being added to tiles, apparently. They make those tiles shinier and more, and gleam more. So there's these kind of illegal uses of some of these parts of these carcasses, and that makes it less attractive in some places to destroy them. But I don't have any numbers on how serious that is, only to say that those things are happening. Those kind of.
In fact, there is a demand for both skin as well as the bone. So now many states, they have something called the rendering plant. So where the rendering plant.
Yeah.
So where they bring all the dead animals, then they take out the skin, they take out the, the meat and then the bones. So the meat is being transferred into, bird feed and other things, and also fertilizers. The skins are being given to the leather industry, and then the leather industry, and the bones are also being, used commercially. So it is not illegal.
Yes, so
I
when
think,
it's done legally, I think that would be fine.
yeah,
I
this
don't
is
know
all
to what
legal.
extent it's done in an underground market, which means that then you won't decompose, you would dump it, but not bury.
So because we also did one study, and we used the data from Maharashtra government on the rendering plants, and did a cost benefit on Maharashtra government. So these are all the government sponsored schemes to take care of the dead animals after the vulture population decline. And we did a cost benefit analysis of breeding vultures in Pinjore vis-a-vis the rendering plants cost, because these plants, they don't, they need a replacement after every 10 years. Whereas if you have the vultures population successfully breed, then they become permanent, because they survive for something like 60 to 80 years, the natural life. So, and we got a very strong, economic result that, okay, it really makes sense to breed vultures rather than going for these rendering plants and other ways of, taking care of the dead animals. Even if you ignore all other benefits from the vultures, only on the basis of scavenging, you can justify that, okay, it's worth, having this population of vultures.
Oh, that's
so
interesting. I had a different prior, but based on not doing any calculations. Is that paper or those calculations public?
There with IUCN India, they didn't publish it. I just did the economics of it. So, but the data was used, all authentic data from Pinjore Breeding Center. That is one Dr. Bibu. You can get in touch with him. So he's running that center, and he has, I think, all the information on vultures of India.
Okay, so I will see if I can, then I will be less.
If you can visit Pinjore, I think you'll get some very good information on vultures. So that data is there with IUCN India, and we did it for Government of India. In fact, they had a scheme.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think that the one issue here is, of course, in this case, the rendering plants are replaced every 10 years. So I guess the life cycle of this infrastructure investment will matter, because we can't wait for the vultures to come before we do something, at least on a large scale. So
yes,
I guess so. This is, I mean, that's all I had for today. I just basically, as I said, we're mostly trying to get the data to answer some of the questions you raise a little better. So the mortality panel is the first thing. As I said, the sample registration system reports, we're trying to find those original reports. I believe JNU library has them, but JNU library was closed in February for COVID. So we're waiting on that. Water quality, there is a paper that Rema Hanna and Michael Greenstone wrote where they use this data, and I think it should be public. So we're trying to look there. And then
can you do some more follow-up on the dogs? I mean, the consequences of the higher dog populations?
In what did you have in mind?
I mean, data on rabies or data on deaths due to dogs and so on.
So rabies, we have basically struck out. I think the data on rabies in India suggests there are a mere handful of rabies deaths. And it seems like most people acknowledge that rabies deaths are just not being counted correctly. But animal bites is something that I am still looking into. The problem with animal bites is it counts things other than dogs. So I am trying to talk to some people to figure out how much signal there is in that noise, because there is some cause of death data, which of course has even more underreporting than total mortality. But that might, if we could see more animal bites, that might be something. So those are the only two. Rabies, I don't think is going to work directly. The numbers are just too small. There's this massive gap between what people say rabies deaths in India are from like small surveys and so on, and what are reported in total deaths.
So there is this cause of death study for which the data were released recently, right? This massive 1 million death study.
I haven't looked at that, but I know it exists. The cause of death data is coming from, yeah, where I said, like from the civil registration. So they do, not every death that is registered has cause of death, but cause of death is there in a subset.
So I think you should look at this 1 million death study because, yeah. I mean, they use some method called verbal autopsies. And since rabies deaths are very characteristic, it should be easy to pick up in verbal autopsies.
I'll check it out. I haven't seen the study, so I'll check it out. That's yeah, that's basically what we had. There's this other angle that we're pursuing, which is around leather industry. There are anecdotal reports that small leather industry was hurt quite a bit by vultures disappearing, because then you have to do this chemical decomposition and so on of carcasses. If you have leather industry at like a household level or a very small unit. And if you remember, ITO bridge in Delhi used to have all those leather industries on the right side, which had flocks of vultures. And now, those industries have gone. They've all moved outside the city. So one thing we're thinking of doing is to just look at the economic census and see if the counts of these leather industries are changing. That's a completely different dimension. So I don't know if it fits into the whole paper as a whole, but maybe it might be interesting to see. Yeah.
It might also be worthwhile to compare the income levels at different vulture suitability terciles. For example, you can use Nightlight's data just to show that pre-trends in income were similar across these kind of districts, and also to have some discussion about how climate suitability might affect income, especially with respect to the technological change that happened after 94, 95. So, because that could affect income, and that could indirectly have impacts on mortality.
I think this balance is an important thing that I haven't yet done, especially.
And that's because the effect sizes are
large,
quite large, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I have. So I'm any further questions? Abhirup, I will write to you about that data.
Yeah, it's the IMS data. So we have it from 91 to 2004, I think. And it should be relatively easy to pick out sales and prices for those.
Yeah, because there should be a discontinuity at 93 or 94 then.
Yeah, so the data starts I think in 91. So that's when we bought it. But you could, I mean, the fact is there will be discontinuity, but you'll also see, you could see temporal changes, right? And for your story, it's the same.
That's true. And, I guess you only care about places where diclofenac was actually being used. And there may be, presumably variations for that reason.
Yeah, but it does not have location though. So you'll have to use basically the same idea, except that also what you will buy is essentially here, you're just looking at, this step jump down from the usage. With the price data, you can just have more annual variation, or maybe, variation over time in the prices.
Yeah.
But they will not get any spatial variation. For that, you'll have to buy kind of space level data, I mean, which is actually very expensive. So you'll have to get market level data.
All right, let me just officially conclude. Thanks, Anant. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
And
Nice.